Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football and NFL landscapes. It could be changing the football landscape in the very near future. So last time I put out an episode just a few short hours after that the AP poll came out, so I did not get to talk about that. So we're going to get my thoughts on this now that I've had a couple days to kind of sit down and really figure out what I think about it. Plus, last week was not a great week for my predictions. I'll be the first to admit that. So I'm going to try to right that and kind of get back on track with 5 predictions for week 2. Before we jump into either one of those topics, though, I'm going to need you to hit subscribe for me. It helps me out a ton. I'd really appreciate it. So with the AP poll, obviously there's going to be a lot of moving around, a lot of shifting in week 1. That happens just about every single year. Now, there are a couple shifts that I found strange, maybe weren't enough of shifts, maybe are something I agreed with, but I don't think will be universally understood or universally accepted. The first one is Notre Dame. I find it very weird that they only fell 3 spots in a loss. I know it was Ohio State. It was a closer game than I gave them credit for, but only dropping them 3 feels very, very weird to me. I want to give you some numbers to kind of show why I think the way I think. So in the top 10, the collective record for all 10 teams is 9-1. Notre Dame is the lone team in the top 10. They're at number 8 now. They had a 3-spot drop that suffered a loss last week. Again, I get it. Strength of opponent wasn't that bad of a loss. But right now, this early in the season, I don't really know that I agree with it, especially when you zoom out even further. Let's look at the top 25. That has a collective record of 23-2. One of those losses sits in your top 10. This early in the year, I don't think you can be doing that. My logic here is that Notre Dame has a good schedule, and they're usually up there anyways, regardless of who they're playing. But why not just let them hot shot their way up? They get to 2-1, you put them back in that 8th spot, as opposed to having a one-loss Notre Dame is currently occupying space in your top 10, when in reality they have plenty of time to fix that, and it's not like it's some big issue right now. Really, who cares as much about the AP poll this early on in the season? It all feels very weird to me. I think you could have afforded to put them at like 18th through the 20th spot just because it is so early on, and kind of let them work their way back up. Another team that I thought probably wasn't pushed down far enough was Utah, who lost an even closer game to Florida. Their spots at 12 and 13 are really a catch-22 for me because I get both sides of it. I just don't really know how you play off of it. On one hand, you've got Florida, who just beat what was perceived as the 7th-ranked team in the country starting this season. It makes sense to have them at 12 or 14 or 15 or whatever because they beat a really good team. But on the other hand, this team that you perceived as great in their first game of the season lost to an unranked team. So putting them at 13 feels very weird to me. I do understand collecting them together. I actually think that's probably the best course of action for these two schools right now because they only lost by just a hair. But for me personally, I probably would have put them 15th, 16th, 16th, 17th, somewhere in there, because being on the other side of the split point and really where the top 25 splits in half at 13, it feels very strange to me to have an 0-1 team kind of as that dead center of your top 25 picks, especially, again, this early on in the season. If I've got Notre Dame falling that far because they lost by 11 to such a high-ranked team, I can't really justify putting Utah still in that top half when they lost to an unranked team. And I think I'm being a little bit picky here because I do think Utah and Notre Dame are good football teams, and I think that's kind of the general range that makes sense for them to end at the end of the season. Plus, the teams that possibly could have passed them, I think, probably got a little bit too much of a nudge this time. USC, BYU, both of those schools and Michigan, got +4 on their spots that they moved within the top 25. They are the largest movers in the top 25 that were already ranked, which with the strength of schedule that they had, 4 spots feels rich to me. I mean, look at it. Michigan beat Colorado State 51-7. USC beat Rice 66-14. BYU came out with a win over USF 50-21. I'm not going to act like any of those teams were anywhere near my top 25s in my prediction videos, nor am I going to act like they weren't anything more than a tune-up game for those 3 schools. So I'm not really sure why the AP poll is acting like they're anything more than a tune-up for those 3 schools. Those were the highest risers, like I mentioned. played less than awesome teams, and either go all in with this and do the same with Miami, who put up 70 points against Bethune-Cookman, or have Arkansas have a higher raise than them because they beat they beat a ranked team, a team that was in the college football playoffs last year. They only moved 3 spots. So that in and of itself feels a bit strange to me and feels very uncomfortable to me, at least, because you have a team that won by double digits over a ranked team, yet you're promoting these teams that beat less than sufficient competition on their way to rising up the boards. The next one I want to look at, you had a couple teams fall out. Obviously, Oregon is nowhere to be found. They got demolished by Georgia. And then Cincinnati, who we just talked about, who beat them, Arkansas, they are both out of the top 25 now. So my question is, who is the true number 26 and who's the team to watch out for? There's a couple candidates here. You've got Penn State, who is coming off of a very close but very tough win over Purdue. Purdue is an underrated place to play. It's a hard place to get a win at, and they have an easy game coming up, whereas Texas is the team right behind them. Penn State came in at 27th, I believe, on the total votes accumulated. Texas coming in at 28th, and then on either side of them was Oregon at 26th, and then 29th was Cincinnati. I don't think you can put a 1-1 school in right now, especially the way Oregon lost, and since Cincinnati was so close to the cutoff point, I don't really know that you can shoot them into that yet. And Texas would make a lot of sense if they were playing literally anybody else that they're playing this week. They're playing Alabama, and we'll get to talk about that game plenty. But I would watch out for Penn State here. I think it makes so much sense for them to become the next team in, especially if Houston gets bumped down again, or if a closer to the back end team that's in the top 25 gets upset. I think Penn State is probably your default team to watch for to move into the top 25 next week. Now, there's another school that was on upset watch this most recent week and jumped down. They were the farthest faller that remained in the top 25. I'm talking about North Carolina State, who a lot of people saw as a potential team that could upset upset Clemson or potentially win the ACC. Now, a lot of people are backtracking on that because of how poor their performance was against Eastern Carolina. One of the big driving points for why NC State was supposed to be good was Devin Leary, who is their quarterback. He was I don't want to say potential Heisman candidate, but certainly somebody to watch for and somebody to keep eyes on. He finished with a 36.8 QBR, 211 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He was underwhelming to say the least against competition that was underwhelming to say the least, especially relative to what people thought the Wolfpack would be this year. It's early. It's not the worst thing in the world. The ACC as a whole did not look particularly awesome, but you've got 3 games until the Clemson game. You've got Charleston Southern, Texas Tech, and UConn. Texas Tech could be a team that messes a couple teams up along the way, but UConn and Georgia Southern should not be, or Charleston Southern, I apologize, should not be teams that cause you issues, yet ECU was supposed to be a team that doesn't cause you issues. So watching the Wolfpack and seeing how they kind of try to get over the hump, or if they can get over the hump, is a very big focal point for me in moving forward. Speaking of moving forward, we've got week 2 college football to look forward to. We got a couple good games on Friday, a ton of good games on Saturday. It looks like it's going to be a pretty good weekend. So let's try to correct my personal record right now. I'm giving myself a 1.5 out of 5 because I predicted that App State game would be a very close one. I said App State would probably win, but I said it would be a thriller, so I'm giving myself half a point on that one. So let's see if I can't readjust that a little bit. I wanted to lead off this with Texas and Alabama, but I'm actually going to go for an SEC-only matchup to start this one because it's not directly a game prediction, but rather a prediction around one of 2 players that will be playing this game. The SEC conference right now, to me, feels very quarterback-driven, especially as somebody who likes to watch out for the NFL draft and players that could be going in the NFL draft. Anthony Richardson and Will Levis are both 2 quarterbacks who play in the SEC who have either very strong supporters or very strong doubters. I believe that this game will almost serve as an eliminator for quite a few people as to which is truly better. I don't particularly enjoy when people single out one specific game, especially whenever it's like Matt Corral and Malik Willis last year when they played. Matt Corral looked better, and I saw a few people, mostly online, so you can't really take too much account for what people online think and their opinions. You can't really take anybody's opinions for too much value, but a lot of people looked at that game and were like, okay, well, Matt Corral played better. You have to take into account the defenses and the people around them when they're playing. I think that could easily become something of an issue for Will Levis or Anthony Richardson, whoever loses this game, especially because I think that one of these quarterbacks, I think it's Levis, but I don't want to fully put my eggs in that basket. Maybe I'm just a little scared from my predictions last week. I don't know. I think it will probably be Levis. I think one of the quarterbacks will underperform, lose the game, and it will become a part of this big narrative that surrounds that quarterback for the rest of the year, because people will look back on it and be like, well, he had his chance to show out against this quarterback or against, whoever, and he didn't do it, and this other quarterback looked better than him. So imagine you're picking at number 16 in the NFL draft next year, and Levis and Anthony Richardson are still on the board. And you're looking at it, and you're going to have some people say, well, in the game where these two played one another, this quarterback performed better. And, I think it'll start pushing more doubt onto one of those specific quarterbacks. Again, I figure it'll probably be Levis. Anthony Richardson just looked too good on the ground last week to really put too much doubt behind right now. Like, I think the game that he had against Utah will kind of even out with this. It'll be a better outcome for him if Florida loses this game than it would be for Levis if Kentucky loses this game. But I think that it will start a small snowball effect around one of these quarterbacks, whoever ends up losing. So, like I mentioned, I wanted to originally start with Texas versus Alabama, but that is a more game-specific prediction, so I wanted to get my more player-driven one out of the way. Texas looked decent last week. Not the strongest of competition, but there's a lot of hype that they could be back. Alabama is going to demolish them. I think it's going to be not a particularly good game to watch because Alabama is Alabama. It doesn't matter who they're playing. Typically, if you see them on the schedule, most people can just kind of say like, all right, that's a loss, let's move on. Now, you have Alabama who, coming off of a very big win against Utah State, they looked more impressive against Utah State than Texas did last week. I can say that with a lot of comfort, saying that Alabama looked better against the Aggies than Texas looked against Louisiana Monroe, which I think we can all agree that Utah State's a better team than Louisiana Monroe by a pretty comfortable distance. I don't see this game, and it came back to bite me last week whenever I said Ohio State would demolish Notre Dame, but I think the difference between these two teams is even larger than what the difference is between Ohio State and Notre Dame by a pretty decent margin. So I personally I looked at BetMGM. The spread right now is 20.5 in Alabama's favor. I've got Alabama covering that. I don't know that I even have the starters coming out after the third quarter. Half seems a little bit rich to me, I will admit. Half seems a bit disrespectful to say, but third quarter, I think we can see a lot of Alabama's second string players in for the last little bit of the game. So last week, I mentioned this is one of my half points, is that App State would keep it close and cause a lot of issues for North Carolina. I think that they're just that kind of program this year that could really hurt and shock a few teams in college football. This week they play Texas A&M, and I think that they'll do a very similar thing, not to the same level that they did against North Carolina, but I do think that Chase Bryce and the boys present issues for A&M early on in the season. Against the spread right now, App State is an 18.5 point underdog, same on BetMGM, which I think they'll cover. I think it'll probably end up being like a 14-point game. I don't think that they're going to take it down to the wire or anything, but I do think App State will cover that 18.5. And they just showed how explosive they can be with that fourth quarter against North Carolina. Yes, it was in Boone. Yes, they will have to go to College Station, but they've got a lot of juice in that offense, and they've got a solid defense whenever they need it to step up. It doesn't look like that, right now because North Carolina put up 60-something odd points on them. But I think that they'll end up kind of causing a lot more issues, especially because I think I have more faith in Drake May right now than I do in Haynes King. And maybe that's just a personal preference, or maybe it's just because I know quarterback competitions usually sketch me out a little bit, especially with huge programs like Texas A&M. But I do personally think Drake May will have, at the end of the day, I think he will have looked better against App State than Haynes King will against App State. A&M's going to win this game. I'm not saying they won't. I just think App State is one of those teams that can mess with your psyche and really get in there and cause a couple issues or make a couple big plays. And all of a sudden you're thinking, wait a minute, are we as good as we think we are, or is this team not, or maybe this team is on our level, and they cause a little bit of a stir. Maybe they're, tied at halftime and then Texas A&M pulls away a little bit. I think App State at the end of the day will be a problem for A&M and cover that line. So that's one high-ranked team that I believe might face a little bit of adversity with an unranked opponent. We move on now to two ranked teams that will be playing each other, Pitt versus Tennessee. And if you'll recall, or if you watched those videos, I had Tennessee as a top 10 team in the country. I think this week they collect their first ranked victory of the season. And all told, I think a lot of it has to do with their offense, because that's just kind of the way that they operate. But I don't know that it's entirely going to be based on the quarterback position. Hendon Hooker is a star, in my opinion. I think he is one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. I think he doesn't get talked about enough within the SEC. And he looked fine last week. Joe Milton came in and made a lot of plays too. But I think that their running game will end up being the true separator. Their running game looked really, really good last week. Take it with a pinch of salt, because obviously they did play Ball State, but Wright had 88 yards on 13 carries and a touchdown. Small had 63 yards on 13 carries and a touchdown. Sampson had 32 yards on 10 carries with a touchdown. Hendon Hooker had 2 rushing touchdowns, so he doesn't entirely have to dominate through the air. I think that there's a lot coming at them, and they've got a lot of different pieces to use, which ultimately we saw Pitt get flustered with West Virginia, who did not look like the same caliber of team that I personally think Tennessee is and will be. So I think this will be the first of, like I said, the first. I do think that they pick up some more along the way. I just think that we probably will see Pitt drop out of the top 25 as Tennessee goes on and beats them. So the last prediction I want to focus on does have a clear winner. I don't really have a prediction as to how close or how distant this game will be, because I do think it's two very good teams. I've got Baylor and I've got BYU's game. I think this will start to present a lot of early season hype for Baylor to potentially be a college football playoff team. BYU is my top-ranked non-Power 5 school this year, but Baylor, they're a real Big 12 threat. I think that they can push OU, and I think they can push OSU to be the top team in that conference this year. We don't really know a whole lot about Baylor's defense yet, with a couple notable losses from last year, most notably Jalen Petrie. I'm not 100% confident in saying that it'll be, this really strong defense, but BYU allowed 14 on defense to USF, who at the starting quarterback position is a quarterback that Baylor let walk in Jerry Bohannon. He is now at USF rather, and while he didn't stand out just a ton, their running game looked good, which I think Baylor can kind of get on track a little bit more against BYU. But the real key here is Blake Shapen. Shapen is a very good quarterback, one that I find very interesting to watch, one that I will continue to watch until he potentially jumps to the NFL. I think they're a very talented team, coached by a very talented man, and I think that they end up beating BYU early on in the season and making a push up the top 25, potentially surpassing Oklahoma, because they don't really have too much going on this upcoming week. And making a real strong case early on. Obviously, they could have some stumbles down the road, which knocks them out. But I think that a win over BYU would be an early, thing to kind of look at and be like, wait a minute, this team might be like a real threat in college football. So what do you think about those predictions? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below, or my Twitter. That will be in the little description down there as well. But for now, that is episode 31 of the From My Perspective podcast. And as always, I'll see you next time.